Okay, this is part B of 23 on Quine. We are going to talk about Quine, but before we do so, I want to sort out some kind of traditional distinctions that philosophers like to make that'll be relevant here. And so there are three ideas: the idea of being analytic, being a priori, and being necessary, that need some spelling out. Maybe they're familiar to you already, but I'll spell them out a little here. And these are three traditional ideas, but in the end, the positivists think that they all will reduce to the one that's fundamentally about language. So that shouldn't surprise you. The positivists were heavy on the analysis of language, verification. We've been talking about this basically almost all through the course. And so I'm going to spell out what these ideas are, what distinction each of these ideas depends on. And the big picture here, though, is that the positivists want the other notions, which might have seemed kind of metaphysical to them, a priori and necessary. They want those to eventually be reducible or definable really as an issue of analyticity. So I know that's very abstract, but that's the setup for why these are relevant at this moment. So let's talk about the three different ideas here. So first of all, there's the idea of being analytic, which is opposed to being synthetic. So an analytic statement is one that's true by virtue of what it means alone, that it's just the meanings that entail its truth. So it's a semantic notion because it's about meaning, and it's about what those meanings entail. So let me give you a kind of example of this, or a couple. Here's one: all tigers are tigers. That seems like an analytic statement because just in virtue of what the terms in it mean, what all and are and tigers mean, it's got to be the case that all tigers are tigers is true. So it depends only on what the statements mean. In fact, that one you could substitute pretty much anything in for tigers. All boxes are boxes, whatever, and still get something that's true simply by virtue of what the terms in it mean. You might also think that analytic statements would include statements like this: all bachelors are unmarried. So there, although it isn't quite in the same way a mere logical truth, the idea is, given what bachelor means, and maybe bachelor means roughly unmarried adult human male, given what bachelor means, it's got to be true that all bachelors are unmarried. If somebody says to you, there is a bachelor who's married, you're going to think that they just don't understand what bachelor means. Because given the meaning of bachelor and married and the logical connectives, all bachelors are unmarried has to be true. Now this contrasts with claims that are synthetic. So synthetic claims are basically ones that aren't analytic. That is, whether they're true or not, synthetic truths depend on not just the meanings of the terms. Typically, they depend on facts about the world. So here are a couple of examples of synthetic truths. So all tigers are less than 50 feet long. Now, I'm pretty sure that's right. In fact, if somebody said they had a tiger that was more than 50 feet long, I'd be pretty incredulous of that. I just don't think tigers can get that big. But I don't think it's a matter of the meaning of the term tiger, that it's got to be the case that they are less than 50 feet long. I think it's a fact about the world, roughly. So even though all tigers are less than 50 feet long is a truth, it's not an analytic truth. That makes it a synthetic truth. So here's a divide, fundamental divide. A divide between analytic truths and synthetic truths. And analytic truths are the ones we think of as being roughly logical truths, although we need a little more than mere logic. We need also something like the definitions of the terms, because think of my, all bachelors are unmarried. You had to also have, for it to be a matter of the meaning, you had to have the meaning of bachelor spelled out as unmarried adult male. So there's one distinction. True by virtue of what it means, or false. True or false by virtue of something else. Typically we might think facts about the world or something like that. All right. Our second notion is the notion of a priori. And a priori means basically known or knowable. People are a little sloppy about this, and we'll just embrace the sloppiness. Known or knowable without experience. So a priori is usually contrasted. Its complement is a posteriori. So not known or knowable without experience. Now keep in mind that this is an epistemic notion, whereas analytic synthetic is explicitly a matter of questions about meaning, true by virtue of what it means or not. A priori versus a posteriori is a question about knowledge. It's a question about how things are known or knowable. That makes it an epistemic notion. So, of course, I said that the positivists wanted to push all these together. They think that a priori is really a question of the only things that are a priori are the things you know in virtue of knowing the meanings, that is, the analytic truths, and the a posteriori are the synthetic ones, or so they suggest. So, in any case, it's on the surface a different distinction, how you know. So, you might think, so here are some things that count as a priori. I take it that I know that 12 plus 7 equals 19, not because I go and test it in the world, but because I can just know it by some kind of maybe examination, some kind of thing I can do without checking out the world in any way. So I know it not by going and examining the world empirically, if you like, a posteriori, but I know it a priori. I can consult my concepts. Now, I'm not necessarily saying that I'm only consulting the meanings of the term, but there's something about knowing it without checking out the world. So that's the distinction, roughly, between the a priori and the a posteriori. Now, you might think that there are things that are knowable a priori that aren't really analytic. Right off the top, I might think, for example, here's something that we know without actually going out and discovering the world. We know that the world is roughly made up of a bunch of three-dimensional mid-sized objects. How do we know that? We probably have brains that evolved to respond to the world made up of medium-sized three-dimensional objects. And so it's probably not the case that we had to learn or check out by experience that that was the world. It might be that it was just utterly and completely innate, inborn, something that we knew automatically just in virtue of having brains of a certain sort. Now, maybe you think that's right, or maybe you think that's wrong, but the point here is that doesn't seem inconceivable. It seems like you might think that there are things that are a priori known by not checking out experience, but just known by the nature of your concepts, that aren't analytic truths. That in general, it's not an analytic truth that the world is made up of three-dimensional objects. All right. Third distinction is the distinction between the necessary and the contingent. So we say that something's necessary if it's not possible that it's false, and contingent if it could be. And so, for example, we might say that necessary truths are truths that are true in all possible situations, no matter how things turn out. This is a metaphysical notion, we usually say. It's a notion of what must be. So I say that, for example, here's something that's true in all possible worlds. I believe that mathematical truths are true no matter how the world turns out. They're true in all logically, coherently imaginable worlds. And here's a mathematical truth. There is no greatest prime number. But the idea that there is no greatest prime number might not follow from the concept of prime number. And whether we can know it a priori or not, well, I definitely had to be taught the proof of whether there's no largest prime number. So the idea here is this is another on the surface distinction between what's true in all possible worlds and what's true only in some. So when you look at these distinctions, we have to ask this question about the positivists. Do these distinctions come to the same thing? The positivists didn't want to get rid of the idea entirely of a priori or necessary. Instead, they wanted to say, to the extent those make sense, they really just are other ways of talking about the distinction between analytic truths and synthetic truths. And that's a distinction they're happy with because they love the whole true and virtue of meaning, breaking down the meanings, analyzing the meanings, and so on.